Okay. Keep giving these pictures of me on my computer. Can't understand why. Okay. Just to iterate, because my daughter gets very upset when you say reiterate before you've said it the first time. First iteration. The holiday of Sukkot in Jewish tradition is the holiday par excellence. It is Chag. Chag means a holiday. But when the rabbis wanted to talk about the different holidays, when they said Chag, they meant Sukkot. That was the joyous time. And we can see because of the harvest aspects to it, the fact that we are hopefully celebrating Thanksgiving for what we've been given. And certainly that is the origin of the concept of a Thanksgiving celebration. So it has that element. It has the added element, which became the custom at some point in history, of completing the Torah cycle. Which day of the holiday do we complete the Torah cycle?
Simchat Torah.
Simchat Torah, which means rejoicing for or rejoicing of the Torah. So this was not universal, by the way. It's interesting. We know that even still in time of Maimonides, we're talking about the 12th century, there still seems to have been some people who lived in Cairo, that area, who read the Torah in the course of like a 3.5-year cycle. Mm-hmm. But they too joined with the community that was celebrating the rejoicing of the Torah. If you can get to a synagogue that has it, I think you will find it interesting experience. I'm too old for it already now, and so plus I spent years trying to get everybody to dance, and so I've had enough of it. That's what happens when you're a rabbi of a synagogue. You got to put on, you're the DJ, as it were. But it can be a very exciting, expressive time. In Orthodox synagogues, obviously, there's separation of sexes. We'll talk about that in a little bit more, as we did last week. In conservative synagogues, men and women are all together carrying Torahs and dancing around together. But it's the singing, the dancing, the celebrating of the Torah. We are celebrating that book, the scrolls really, that make for what Judaism is. And so we're celebrating all of Judaism. So Simchat Torah can have an added meaning, just like the word Torah has a multiplicity of meanings. It can be the physical Torah scroll, all 5 books of Moses. It can be the Torah, meaning the 5 books of Moses, whether it's in the scroll or it's in a book form. It can also be the meaning of teaching, of law, instruction. And ultimately, Torah is all of Jewish life, all of Jewish teaching. All those are shades and meanings of the word Torah that we're celebrating. And the venue for that celebration normally is in the synagogue. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. What is this? What makes a place a synagogue? Where does the synagogue come from? We know that Judaism, like all the ancient religions, originates in a worship of the divine through sacrifices. Animals, sometimes offerings of wheat, flour, grain, are burnt on the altar. Sometimes they are consumed by the priests, or partially consumed by the priest. Sometimes they're partially consumed by the celebrant. One of the most important sacrificial celebrations of the Passover sacrifice, the lamb was taken home and eaten with the family. Okay, so, but that's how most of the world saw its way to worshiping the divine. It probably has its origins when you look at the different ways in trying to understand what the divine was. There is a work called the Enuma Elish. Enuma Elish is a old creation story account. It's found in Babylonian, Akkadian, I forget exactly which languages. It has certain parallels to the biblical account, which opens the door for biblical criticism, which we'll talk about much later on. But it has a story of a flood, which parallels in some ways very different from the story of Noah. But at the end, just like in the story of Noah, what does Noah do when he comes out of the ark and he's all ready to start life anew? He offers a sacrifice to God. And the language used in the Torah frequently is reach nichoach, a fragrant aroma. The burning of the flesh on the altar, reach nichoach. I don't know. It usually smells bad to me if I'm burning something on the barbecue, but that's referred to as reach nichoach. But the major difference is that in the Enuma Elish, the gods regret the flood, and because there's no one to offer them sacrifices and they're hungry. And so it describes the gods coming around the sacrifice of Utnapishtim, I think, Utnapishtim, I believe is his name, who offers this sacrifice like flies. That's the language used. The Torah never describes God as actually consuming, getting anything per se from the sacrifice. Now, whether the historian wants to say it derives from that, is not important. What is important is we have to understand that was the way that the ancients' major way of worshiping the divine. Now, you don't change your way of doing things easily, but sometimes you have no choice. And we know in the year 70 of the Common Era, the Temple of Jerusalem is destroyed. The Temple in Jerusalem was accepted by the entirety of the Jewish people by that period in history as being the only location for offering sacrifices to God. Now you no longer have that opportunity. What do you do? Now, Judaism, fortunately, was already on the path to creating an institution that could take the place, or at least stand in the place, of the temple, the synagogue. We don't know when the first synagogues came into being. We know that we have references to Israel being in exile in Babylonia. 586 BCE, the first temple is destroyed. The remainder of the leadership of the Jewish community is exiled by the Babylonians to Mesopotamia. We have one of the Psalms, Al Narot Bavel Sham Yashan Gam Bachinu V'Zachrenu Et Sion. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and cried and we remembered Zion. And they say to them, sing to us a song of Zion. But they couldn't. There was no way of offering sacrifices outside of at least the land of Israel, and according to accepted Jewish tradition in the temple in Jerusalem once that was established. So what do? So I have a conjecture. That's all it is. I have no data for it, no proof for it. I like to listen to a podcast called Data versus Dogma, which is very upsetting to those who believe in the Bible, but there is no data. We have no statement of what took place. But I surmise that they felt a need to feel close to the divine, to God. How do you do it? It could be, we certainly know some of the Psalms already existed, if not all of them. According to tradition, King David and others wrote them. But some of them clearly existed. The Psalm talking about Al Narot Bavel, the rivers of Babylonia, we sat and wept. Others, it's possible that some of the earliest of the Psalms were recited in the temple as part of this temple sacrificial system. Maybe they recited some of those Psalms in lieu of the sacrifices. Maybe they read words of the Torah. Maybe they heard from prophets who were still amongst them. And when they returned to the land of Israel, somewhere between then and the destruction of the temple, the synagogue came into its earliest being. We have ruins of synagogues contemporaneous with the end of the Second Temple period. If you go to Masada, they'll all point out to you the synagogue in Masada. The New Testament, which is not, has some evidence that we can use on certain issues, talks about Jesus speaking in the synagogue. Now, even if it's not historically accurate, by the time of the writing of the Gospels, around the year 70 to 100 CE, the concept of the synagogue was accepted as normative, so that Jesus would have to have appeared in the synagogue. You can even go to the synagogue, Far Nachum, Capernaum. Only that was actually built years later, but anyway. So at the beginning of the Common Era, we have the beginnings of the institution of the synagogue. By the year 200 of the Common Era, when the Mishnah is codified, the Mishnah is a record of oral law. There was already an understanding of a kind of service that took place in the synagogue, the Beit Knesset. And the prayer service develops and becomes part and parcel of the synagogue. And we will talk in detail about the Siddur later on, but as we look at the Machzor, what does the Siddur consist of, the prayer book? It consists of biblical passages, Psalms, other parts of the Bible, and rabbinic prayers, rabbinic composed prayers and blessings. So one of the most important, or the most important of those biblical passages, the Shema, Hear Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone or only one God. We'll talk about Echad later on also, is preceded by rabbinic composed blessings and followed by rabbinic composed blessings. That unit in rabbinic literature is referred to as Kriyat Shema, recitation of the Shema, with the understanding that there are prayers that precede and follow the biblical passage. When we read from the Torah, the order is a blessing, recitation of the Torah passage, and a blessing. The Haftarah, the prophetic reading, blessing, prophetic reading, blessing. It's referred to as the Matbeah Tefillah, the structure of the Tefillah. So that begins early. We can't know when. Rabbinic tradition, the Talmud, reads back into history many things. So, for example, there seem to be 17 years missing in the life of Jacob. What did Jacob do during those 17 years? He was studying in yeshiva. Maybe he was studying yeshiva. The Torah hasn't even been given. How can be studying Talmud in yeshiva? That's how they saw it. The rabbis read into the past. After all, if Abraham, the first and greatest Jew of all, was such a great person, he had to study. He had to learn Torah. He had to observe Torah and mitzvot. How else? What else would he do? It's like the joke, how do you know that Abraham wore a black hat? Not Abraham, Jacob. Because it says in the Torah, Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheva. Jacob left Beersheva. Would he leave home without putting on his hat? Of course not. So he must have worn a black hat on his way out. So it's no different if you pick up illustrations for kids, books, Jewish books that come from the very Orthodox community. You will see pictures of rabbis of ancient days who look a lot like the rabbis walking down the street on Bathurst. My niece, when she first came to Toronto, she saw everybody who had a hat, black hat, had to be a rabbi. Okay, that must be a rabbi, she thought. In Jacksonville, Florida, the only ones who wore a black hat were the rabbis that were around there. Okay? Because you project to the past what you think is important in the present. I accept that as a reality. I don't necessarily accept that Abraham studied Torah in the yeshiva of Shem Va'ever for X number of years. But as when we talk about Midrash in more detail, Midrash is meant to teach us ideas and values. It's not, I don't think it's meant to be taken as a newspaper report of what took place. It's religious history. And religious history does not have to be 100% factually accurate. But all right, so somewhere during those 200 years or even a little bit earlier, because the rabbinic tradition, it says the prayer service began even earlier, we begin to have the structure of the prayer service. And ideally, it would take place in the synagogue. What was the synagogue? Usually what it was 4 walls and a roof. That's all it had to be. And interestingly enough, the archaeologists talk about 2 structures, architectural styles that were used for synagogues in the first few centuries. One is called the broad house because it's a rectangle, but the positioning was that the eastern door and the western side were closer to each other than the south and north. Another more common one is referred to as basilica. Everybody knows about basilicas, right? That's a church. No, basilica simply was a structure for public gatherings. And what it normally was a rectangular shaped building, 2 rows of pillars running down, dividing the space into 3 areas to support the roof. That's a basilica. Now, St. Peter's Basilica is a little bit bigger and fancier than that, but that's what it was. We know that the earliest synagogues in some ways wanted to pattern themselves after the temple in Jerusalem. Now, the temple in Jerusalem was on a east-west axis. The main gates coming into the temple were on the east. When the sun rose, the sun would shine. Again, that's not unique to Judaism. The idea of facing east to the rising sun, whether you regard the sun as divine or not, that was a common structure idea. So, and then as you go in from the east, moving west, you would first go through the outer court, which was called Ezrat Nashim, the women's court, because women and men both were allowed in there. Then you would go up 15 steps to the next level through Nicanor Gate, and women were not allowed past that point. And then a little bit west of Nicanor's Gate, you would find yourself in the major part of the temple precincts, near the altar. If you went further west, you come to the temple itself, the Heichal, and you keep going west, you end up at the Holy of Holies. Okay? And then there's no door in the back of the Holy of Holies, but you get behind it and you go to the end of the precinct. And if you look down, you're looking at what we call the Western Wall today. Okay? The Western Wall is underneath. It's a retaining wall to hold up the Temple Mount. Okay. So it seems that the earliest synagogues were designed, you came in from the east, and then you would turn around and face towards the opening to the synagogue for prayer. And still to today, the traditional synagogue is oriented so that you face east when you pray, at least in North America. Well, there's some discussion in the Talmud about which way you're supposed to orient yourself. The accepted custom was you are orient yourself towards the east in general. So the way it's described in the sources, outside of Israel to the east, you face east. In Israel, you face towards Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, you face towards the Temple Mount. So that if you're in the Galilee in the north, today you face south. If you're in the south of Jerusalem, you face north. Here, we face east, not necessarily on a direct line, but more or less east. That's the tradition that we follow. The earliest synagogues did not have a permanent structure to house the Torah. It seems that the Torah was kept in a movable chest, an aron. When it was to be used in the service, it would be brought in from a side room. Now, this basilica style design, even the broad house design, frequently had 3 doors. Large ones in the middle and 2 smaller ones on either side. Some theorize that the middle doors are only used to bring the ark in, and the other 2 are for people to come in. We don't know. But presumably what they did was, they would bring the ark in from the eastern side and set it down so that the Torah, when it's taken from the ark, is to the east of everybody. What else do we know from the earliest architecture? We know that some of the earliest synagogues had the place where the person who chanted the service, I'm going to use the term cantor for lack of a better term right now, actually prayed not raised up, but below, lower down than the main floor. Based on the Psalm, Akim Karatiyah, from the depths I cried out to the Lord. So in the language used by in the rabbinic sources is Yored Lifnei Teva. You go down before the ark. And probably we know that there were certain things that were chanted by the cantor, things that were chanted by everybody. We don't have full details of how it was done. We do know the Shema was one of the earliest things. We know the Ten Commandments originally was part of the worship service. It's described as being done by the Kohanim, the priests in the temple, before the destruction of the temple. Some of these buildings had fancy benches on the sides, and you can guess who got the fancy benches, the fancy donors. Things haven't changed much. Okay? And we have inscriptions. The synagogue dedicated by X, Y, or Z. Okay? Some of these synagogues had tiled floors. Fascinating in not Tzfat, Tzipori. What's the English word for Tzipori? Sepphoris. Tzipori sounds better. Tzipori which is the sense of rabbinic leadership around the end of the 2nd century, had a very fancy mosaic floor that you can see in the Israel Museum today in Jerusalem. But strangely enough, it had the zodiac on the floor. And in the middle of the zodiac is the chariot for the sun god. There's a one second, I'll answer. There's a cheaper version. Obviously, they didn't have the money, so they got the secondhand artist in a kibbutz Beit Alpha. That, at least according to the recording at Beit Alpha, and when you go to visit there, they tell you they copied it from the fancier synagogue. Yes.
What's the name of the museum in Jerusalem?
The Jerusalem Museum. The Israel Museum. I'm sorry, the Israel Museum. The Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Yeah. That's also where you can find some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. All right. So now, we know that rabbinic Judaism, which gives rise to Judaism as we know it today, was guided by the rabbinic group, the rabbis of the eras. But we also know clearly, even from their own words, that not everybody listened to them. Why should things have been any different then than they are now? Okay. So we do know, though, that the rabbis were not so stringent in many ways about pictures in the synagogue. There's a synagogue in Edura Europa. It's in it's either Western Iraq or Eastern Syria. I forget exactly. You want to look it up. I may send you some things later. Dura Europa. And it's covered with pictures, biblical pictures of various stories from the Torah. Now, the eyes are gouged out. It's thought maybe at some point in time, some Jews, and it's not such a nice thing to have all these pictures of people on the wall, and they gouged out the eyes to make it less real or something. Right? But it is very Byzantine in style. And I saw a theory that was suggested that the Byzantine artists took their stylistic way of doing things from Jewish artists, because the earliest Byzantine art was based upon stories from the Tanakh, not the New Testament. And even behind the heads of the heroic figures, Moses, Abraham, are square halos, which was what was done in Byzantine art. So, and we have also found menorot, the 7-branch menorah, which later the rabbi said you're not allowed to have a 7-branch menorah. And if you go to a synagogue that has it, usually the middle is somehow doesn't look like a candle. It may have a star on it, or maybe designed a little differently so that it looks like it, but it's not really it. Some of the synagogues had decorative devices of the menorah. Others had decorative devices of implements that were used in the temple. So that we see that they were thinking of the Beit HaMikdash, they were thinking of the temple when they created these designs for these synagogues. And as time went on, the synagogue and the schoolhouse became, Beit Midrash became the two centers of Jewish life for prayer and intellect. One of the other things we know is that there seems to have been, in a lot of the synagogues that were built in the Galilee, an outside stairwell leading to the top layer or story of that building. Now, those who want to defend the mechitza and the separation of the sexes say, see, here's proof that even in the earliest synagogues, men and women sat separately, because here's the obvious going up to the women's section, Ezrat Nashim. Others suggest no, it was just to get to the storage area on top of the top layers of the synagogue. Can't know. We do know that even in medieval Europe, there were some synagogues that were not constructed originally with a women's section, and then a women's section was added on later on. If you ever have the opportunity to go to Prague, which is a gorgeous city, and the Jewish quarter is fascinating, and you go to what is called the Alte Neue Schule. Now, the Alte Neue Schule in Yiddish and is interpreted as the old new synagogue, which means at one time it was the new synagogue. Then they built another synagogue, so this one became the new synagogue, and this one became the old new synagogue. But it is very clear that this women's section in the back was added on, because there are windows on the side of the building, on the sides of it, and there are windows like that in the back, and the women's section was built behind it. What that means historically, who knows? I mean, it was added later on. Women didn't go to shul in those days. They started going. They didn't want to be together or not. We know that churches weren't necessarily had mixed seating. Men and women in medieval churches often sat separately. We can't know. So this is in terms of the structures. Today, if you ask me architecturally, what makes a synagogue? The answer is anything. All you have to do is look around Toronto at the various synagogues and the various architectural styles, and you will see that there is no synagogue style. You know the cathedral, the basilica, right? It still has the basilica format. You have the nave. You have at the end of it, you have the apse, and off to the sides, two sides, giving you the cross setup for the basilica. We don't have any of that. As I said, the earliest synagogues, they didn't have a permanent ark. However, by the time of Dura Europa, for example, it had become customary to put the entrance to the synagogue on the west side. So you walked in and didn't need to turn around to face east. And as you walked in, on the western wall of the synagogue, on the eastern wall of the synagogue, was a nave, an apse, where an ark could be built in to hold the Torah scrolls. And so it became the custom and the accepted custom to the modern era that you tried to build the synagogue with the western side of the building, the entryway, so that when you come through, you're facing east. Now, excuse me, one prime example one prime example of how that created its own issues, if you go a little bit south from here on Bathurst, you come to Holy Blossom. Now, Holy Blossom began life as an Orthodox synagogue, which most synagogues had begun life as. Eventually became a Reformed synagogue. They moved from their original site, and they wanted to stay on Bathurst. After all, if you're Jewish, you have to be near Bathurst. That's one of the unwritten laws of Toronto. Since they were, it was on the western side of Bathurst. If you put the entrance to Holy Blossom on the west side of the building, you would, you'd be like looking at the back of the building from Bathurst. That's pasnished. Anybody know what pasnished means? Just, don't do it. It's not good. Nice Yiddish term. It's pasnished. If you don't know what else to say why it's not right, you say it's pasnished. Can't give you an answer, but it's not right. It's pasnished. So Holy Blossom faces west. You walk through the eastern doors into the sanctuary, and you're facing west because they wanted to have a fancy entrance facing Bathurst. It was a conscious choice that they made. And a few years ago, there was a whole big fight because some of the people there wanted to change it, and they wanted to put the ark so that you're facing east. And the hullabaloo it was several bodies were cast around, and the throats were slit, and just don't know. But they ended up not doing that. Okay. And we'll talk more about some changes that Reform introduced later on. Okay. Now, generally speaking, synagogues weren't terribly big. I mentioned the Altnu Shule in Prague. It's probably about the size of this room, the main section of it. Right? And the tradition was that you would read the Torah in the middle of the room so everybody could hear. And you would be facing the ark. And people would sit either facing the ark or facing the front of the bima from the sides, variations on a theme. Then on the eastern wall is what we call in Hebrew the Aron HaKodesh, the Holy Ark. The ark is supposed to contain the Torah scrolls. And then above the ark, in the traditional synagogue, will be a light that is left on called a ner tamid. Ner, lamp or flame. Tamid, perpetual, eternal, the eternal light. So various interpretations of what it means. It represents Torah, the light of Torah, God's eternal presence, various things like that. We know in the temple, when the temple stood, one of the lamps of the menorah was lit every evening towards sunset. In the morning, they would clean out the lamps, get them ready for the next night, but one lamp was always left burning. So that's also related to this ner tamid, this eternal light. In the traditional synagogue style, the person who conducted the service, the chanter, that's cantor means chanter. In Hebrew is also called a chazan, or it can be called shliach tzibur, the messenger of the congregation, was usually at the front of the room. Again, it's a relatively small space, and everybody could hear. And by having the Torah read in the middle on a raised platform, it was reminiscent of two things. One, it was reminiscent of the altar in the temple, because the altar was tall, high up. Also, you're reading the Torah higher up. And when was the Torah given? Where was it given traditionally?
Mount Sinai.
Mount Sinai. So every time you read the Torah, you're reenacting the giving of the Torah at Sinai. So that's part of the rationale for having that raised platform. That technically is the bima. In front of the ark, because usually you have to go up at least a few steps to go to the ark. That area in front of the ark in Yiddish was called the duchen. And duchen is where the priests would stand when they do the priestly blessings for the community. And depending upon the nature of the synagogue, seating, different kinds of seats, benches, chairs, cushions on the floor, what have you. The greatest status was always to be near the eastern wall. Again, things haven't changed. The big money givers usually got that privilege. The rabbi would get that privilege as well. In the 19th century, when Reform Judaism begins, one of the conscious efforts by the rabbis who were creating Reform Judaism was they wanted to maintain the Jewish community, despite the slurs that are cast at them from people today. The Reform rabbis are not out to destroy Judaism. They're trying to save it. They thought by making the synagogue more like the church, they could hold on to Jews. In the 19th century, there was a lot of turmoil that had taken place. Jews were beginning to be able to be part of society, but they still had certain levels of restrictions. And some saw that the only way they could get fully accepted was to convert. So the rabbis, at least the Reform rabbis, thought if we kind of make it more like what the neighbors have, we could hold on to the Jews better. So that's why they moved everything to the front of the room, first of all. Because if you go to the church, where does everything take place? In the front. And so the service was directed that way. The role of the priest or the role of the preacher, the minister in the church was much more important. So the rabbi became a much more important figure in the synagogue. And they made fancier pulpits for the rabbi to speak from. All of this was in part because this is what was done in churches. And it was done for good reasons. I mean, whether it's right or wrong is irrelevant. For the best of reasons. They weren't doing it to be nasty. But of course, the opponents, the non-reformers, lambasted them for changing from what was Jewish tradition. Now, as synagogues began to grow in size, also another problem came up. It's hard to hear. The more cathedral-like the room, the more difficult it is to hear. Now, we do know that it's not the first time that happened. We're told in the Talmud there was a synagogue in Alexandria, Egypt, that was so big that there were people who had flags. And when the Chazan would finish the blessing and everybody was supposed to say Amen, they would raise the flag. So that people in the back of the room would know to say Amen. And also it was divided. You had the sandal makers in this section, and you had the blacksmiths in this section. You had goldsmiths over here and rug people here. They had their own little communities that they sat around and probably talked about business, and we really shouldn't have done. Okay. So that's where we begin to have questions about introducing sound amplification to the synagogue. The role of choirs take on a much bigger role. There were some choirs earlier, but now they became more important. Introduction of musical instruments into the synagogue, that came about as a part of those reforms that affected the synagogue in a sense of architecture. I think I mentioned it last week that one of in the 60s, one of the major ways to build a synagogue was because most people didn't show up all the time. They came for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and you needed more space, so you had a back wall that opened up in some way, so that you close. It was a social hall the rest of the year, and on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, you packed the rest of the people in there. Okay. And then, like I said, if you look around, you'll see every different kind of architectural style is around. There was a period of time in which Moorish architecture was in vogue. So synagogues followed that kind of thing. There were synagogues designed by great architects. Detroit's was it Wright?
Frank Lloyd Wright.
Frank Lloyd Wright. There's a synagogue in Detroit that was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. All right. There are synagogues that were designed by somebody who built a church, and the Jews later on bought the church and they turned it into a synagogue, and vice versa. There are synagogues that became churches later on. Yeah. So that's the architecture of it. Now let's go back inside. Most people, the first thing they think about for an individual is the rabbi. Now, we know that the concept of a Rav, of a teacher, of a master, dates back to earliest Jewish recorded history. The Rav, or the Rabbi, in Israel, the institution of smicha, of granting authority, which was supposed to have derived from Moses, was to appoint an individual as a sage, and they were given the title of Rabbi, my teacher, my master. And according to the Mishnah and Talmud, there were certain kinds of laws that they could adjudicate, for example, fines, biblical fines. The Bible says, if I steal your horse, I have to pay back double. The horse and another horse. The extra horse is a fine. Okay. So they could adjudicate cases in which a fine was imposed and other things, including theoretically the death penalty. In Babylonia, they did not give that ordination, so the title used was Rav. And when you study the Talmud, you discover whenever somebody's a Rabbi, it means he comes from Israel. When he's a Rav, he comes from Babylonia. But they had nothing to do with the synagogue. They were judges. They were teachers. There was no direct connection whatsoever between the Rav, which is a title all rabbis got later on, although in Sephardic lands they're usually referred to as a chacham, a sage. There was no direct connection necessarily between the rabbi and the synagogue. Indeed, you would have a community in which you would have the Rav, the rabbi of the community, and there might be several synagogues in that community. And he might run a rotation going to different synagogues at different times. But remember last week I said the rabbi didn't necessarily preach in the synagogue. He was there to oversee things. Religiously, he was the decisive. If you had a question, you go to the Rav. If you have the chicken, is the chicken kosher or treif? You go to the rabbi. Rabbi, is it kosher or treif? And he would say yes or no. If you had a famous episode, a bunch of teenage kids are playing around, and one of the boys gives a girl a ring in front of a couple of other boys of bar mitzvah age, and he says, "Harayat mekudeshet li b'davat, you're married to me with this ring." And she takes the ring. Are they married? Do they have to have a get? A Jewish divorce? Very serious question. Very problematic. You took that to the Rav. You didn't go to your neighbor next door and say, "What do you think, Charlie?" But eventually, in the modern era, rabbis retained that role, but also became what is essentially a minister of the synagogue. And matter of fact, in England, that's the title they give to the rabbi of the synagogue. He's a minister. And I don't even know if they use the title rabbi for those ministers or not. I don't remember. So with beginning in the 19th century and into the 20th and now the 21st century, more and more rabbis took on the role of minister and pastor of a synagogue. Now, every rabbi is considered, in general anyway, to serve the Jewish community as a whole. That they believe and they feel they have obligations to the entirety of the Jewish community, but they do have a home base. They're expected to be at that synagogue for services. They're expected to preach at that synagogue and services. They're expected to visit the sick from that synagogue before anybody else they're going to visit. So the rabbi becomes the minister, pastor, counselor for the synagogue. Therefore, the rabbi is hired by the synagogue. Rabbis in general have a contract with the synagogue that employs them. And that can lead to all kinds of issues, but that's the general shape of things. The rabbi of this synagogue is employed by this synagogue. Now, so the rabbi functions in certain ways in a synagogue that are very clear. As I said, all these pastoral duties. One area that can become a real bone of contention, and depending on the nature of the synagogue, how they relate to the rabbi. Because the rabbi traditionally was the decisor of Jewish law. So the rabbi should be the decisor of anything that has religious, halachic, legal implications in the synagogue. The term is Mara de Atra, or Mara de Asra, master of the locale. In some synagogues, especially in Orthodox synagogues, that's taken absolutely for granted. You have a question of what takes place in the synagogue service, you go to the rabbi. Even in those in traditional conservative synagogues, when I was a rabbi of a synagogue, my contract clearly said I was the one who decided religious rules and regulations. If anybody wanted to make a change in what the synagogue did, I had to give approval to it as the rabbi. Now, I'll tell you a story. I love this one. Many moons ago, in my synagogue here, there was a discussion about attire in the synagogue. Not tires, but how you dressed. Now, it was a very traditional conservative synagogue, but women did chant the book of Ruth on Shavuos, and later on we introduced them to the other Megillot that they would chant. And some of them wanted to be able to do it in whatever few things they could do as part of the ritual in the synagogue, wearing pants, slacks. So I had a ritual committee. Ritual committee could decide some things. And so the first thing was asked to me, what is my opinion? If I said no, then that's no, that's the end of the story. I said, I prefer a dress, but I don't think that's my decision. Okay? Because we live in a society in which women wear slacks. Okay? So it's up to the committee. And we had this meeting all planned. It was going to be open to the congregation because everybody knew this was going on. And there were pro and cons for women wearing slacks and participating any way in the service. And some guys said, you know what? We don't really like having to wear a tie to get an honor in the synagogue. Okay. So we got this night planned out. There's going to be a whole hullabaloo about women wearing a dress or wearing slacks and what have you. I think it was 2 hours we argued over jackets and ties, and about 2 minutes over slacks. 2 minutes that was taken care of. Sure, they want to wear slacks. Let them wear slacks. No, you got to wear a tie in the synagogue. You're going to be called up to the Torah. You have to have a tie on. I don't like wearing a tie. Never wear a tie. Why should I have to wear a tie in the synagogue? Believe me, it almost came to blows. Really did. It really did. It was the funniest thing, I tell you. And I know there's some rabbis who think everything is the rabbi's role. So you want to change the carpet? I get to decide what design on the carpet. That's for sure. Why put yourself in that position anyway? Okay. All right. Some synagogues, it's up to the ritual committee. The rabbi has a voice, but not a veto. So that's how they deal with it. Okay? So it depends on the synagogue how they view the function of the rabbi in terms of religious authority. Okay? So, people will come up in the middle of service. For example, I daven at an Orthodox shul. I'm not an Orthodox rabbi, but I have people sometimes asking me a question. Rabbi, do we do this or that? And if it's something I know right away and I have no issues with it, no problems with it, I give them an answer. But if it's anything that really is any serious matter, go ask the rabbi. You don't ask me. Okay? The Rav of the shul. Okay, so depending upon the shul, you may have just one rabbi. Large congregations have employed more than one, especially since there are a lot of pastoral duties, visiting and things like that require lots of time and effort, and there's only so much time that a person has. And the synagogues may emphasize some things over the others. I always emphasize teaching and study. The synagogue usually preferred the pastoral aspects of things. So you may have more than one rabbi. Usually you have one rabbi who is the chief honcho, the chief rabbi or the head rabbi, and the other one will either be called the associate if he's up there, or assistant if he's down here. Okay. Now, the other major player in most synagogues, at least up until recently, things are beginning to change again, was the cantor. Now we know that the Jewish liturgy, in theory, can be recited by anyone that the synagogue accepts to be able to do it. Right? Traditional synagogues, only men. Right? Egalitarian synagogues, men or women, depending on their nature. Okay. But the different services and different times a year require different kinds of knowledge. The weekday service, you don't necessarily need no much of a tune, the nigun. Shabbat requires a little bit more. Plus, you want somebody who can sing, because most congregations like to have some singing as part of their synagogue service. So it's nice to get somebody up there who, one, knows how to read Hebrew. I've seen cases where that wasn't the case. Has a pleasant voice and knows what is called nusach. Nusach, N-U-S-A-C-H, is the way the prayers are supposed to be chanted. If you remember on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Baruch Hu would be I can't sing with a bit. Baruch Hu Hashem HaMivorach. Right? You know it's Rosh Hashanah. If it's Friday night, Baruch Hu et Hashem hamivorach. It varies a little bit, the different Yom Tovim and the weekday. Baruch hu atah Hashem hamivorach. Just one quick 1, 2, 3. So we have had throughout Jewish history individuals whose function was to be a cantor, a chanter. Sometimes they would have a small choir with them, usually men, always men in the, up until the modern era. No musical accompaniment. And then there was a long tradition of the nusach, the way the prayers were recited. And sometimes these chazanim, cantors, became very famous, well known, well respected. You would have, for example, some chazanim who were not, or they grew up Orthodox, but they were chanting the chazanut in a non-Orthodox synagogue, and even guys, Hasidim with strymos would come in to hear them daven. They themselves wouldn't daven there, but they came to hear them daven. Okay, and then some, I was Rabbi Allen, who subs for me. He has a book on chazanim, and the other day, we were learning with him about there was a case with Yossele Rosenblatt. Yossele Rosenblatt was a well-known cantor at the beginning of the 20th century, 20th century. And he got special permission to sing in an opera, because they couldn't afford to pay him too much. Then there was another, in the more modern era, Tucker, I forget his name right now, first name, who was also offered a position. He was a cantor of a synagogue, and he was offered a role as an opera singer. And he was turned down by the synagogue. He couldn't have both. So he ended up doing the opera. And he regretted that he lost the position at the synagogue. He really liked it. Even still today, you will have people who appreciate chazanut, the musical quality of the prayer service, and are attracted by a chazan or a chazanit, a female presenter. But in many ways, it's fallen out of favor. And there are fewer and far between chazanim in Orthodox shuls today. More and more, it's lay people who have some knowledge who do the chanting. Most conservative synagogues still try to have a cantor for at least the Sabbath and holiday services, weekday services, whomever leads the service. That's not usually an issue. Reform congregations also, but there too, in both conservative and reform, due to financial issues and all kinds of other things, it's become a difficult situation to be able to afford all the personnel that are necessary to have all of these things. So now we come to one of the most important issues. Oh, no, we'll come to that in a minute, money. But before we get there, also many synagogues, especially a lot of big conservative synagogues, will have an individual who will have various titles: ritual director, shamash. This kind of person usually is knowledgeable. Does not necessarily mean that they have their rabbi or have full cantorial training, but they supervise the daily minions. When there's need for a minion, they're the one who has to get on the phone and call. They may be the Torah reader for in general purposes. Sometimes they're given the title reverend. You don't hear that too much anymore. But Reverend Barris was the ritual director of the shul that I was in Detroit. He was a rabbi. He had smicha, but he was called Reverend Barris. He was a wonderful man. Again, if you have a school associated with the synagogue, you will have might have a school principal. Big synagogues, because of time constraints, the rabbi doesn't usually have enough time for that. Small synagogues, they don't have the budget otherwise, so the rabbi runs the Hebrew school, and what have you. Okay. Now, all of this costs money. Now, synagogues are essentially voluntary, independent organizations, charitable organization. It has to have its own incorporation rules. It has to meet whatever standards are necessary for a charitable institution to meet if they're going to be able to give receipts for charitable donations. They are independent. Almost all synagogues are independent. By that, I mean, they have a board of directors or overseers or whatever the title they use for it. There is no organization above it that can tell a synagogue what it has to do. However, again, things are changing. Most synagogues want to be identified with a particular stream in Judaism. And so in order to really be a conservative synagogue, you have to be a member of United Synagogue. United Synagogue is the organization of synagogues for the conservative movement in North America. And United Synagogue has certain rules and regulations that you have to, at least in theory, live up to. So that, for example, men are expected to wear a head covering and wear a tallis in shul. Now, depending on the synagogue, women too, but that's not been an ironclad thing for everybody. The synagogue itself has to keep kosher. Okay? I don't remember. There were a few other rules that were part and parcel of it. One of the rules had to do with hiring a rabbi. A conservative synagogue was supposed to go to the joint board that exists for placement of rabbis in the conservative movement, and not supposed to go outside it. And conservative rabbis are not supposed to go outside of that placement service. So the stick is that, plus you got to pay your dues. And every synagogue has fewer members when it comes for dues payments than they have other times. When they're bragging, they have more members. When they're paying, they usually have fewer members. It sort of sounds like a former president. But anyway, now sometimes you have struggles. One wonderful example was in the late 50s, early 60s, the Union of Orthodox Synagogues, I mentioned this when I talked about Mechitza in passing, passed a rule. In order to be a member of the Orthodox Union, you must have at least one Mechitza minyan. Or the main minyan had to have a Mechitza or something along those lines. And if you didn't, by a certain date in time, you were thrown out of that synagogue body. They drew a line in the sand, and this is what we stand for. Then on the other side of the spectrum, and there was a whole thing a number of years ago, there was a humanistic synagogue. Humanist Judaism doesn't believe in God as a divine personal God, or even if God at all exists. Right? They wanted to join the Reform synagogue movement. And interestingly enough, they were turned down. And you got to believe in God. What God does, that's a different story. But you got to at least pay lip service to there is a God. So they would live. So those are what exists there. And of course, whatever rules and regulations may exist in communities of concern, but generally speaking, courts like to stay away from religious institutions. So In Toronto, we have Beth Israel, we have Beth David, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Beth Emet, Beis Yehuda. We have Beth. I said Beth Tzedek. What's on? What else is official conservative synagogue? I'm missing something. Beth Shalom. Yeah, Beth Shalom is official. Adath Israel. I think I said Adath Israel. And Beth Tikva. Thank you. That's the one I was trying to think of. Beth Tikva. I think those are all the official synagogues. There are others who call themselves conservative, but they're not officially conservative synagogues in the sense of paying their dues. There's been a lot of falling away in the last few years. COVID was a disease not only of the physical body, but it hurts synagogues left and right. And a lot of them have not recovered from it. You know, if you can watch a Zoom class, why bother showing up? That's why we say you're not supposed to watch unless it's an absolute necessity. If you're going to Zoom services, why join a synagogue? And since you can Zoom a service from New York or Los Angeles, where they got fancy synagogues and fancy rabbis and what have you, why, you know, it was, believe me, it was an interesting, fascinating debate that the conservative synagogues had over what to do. I was already out of the synagogue business by then, didn't have to worry about it. But even Orthodox synagogues, because of the COVID restrictions and everything, some of them never recuperated their minions the way they had been. Right? Beth Emet has daily minions without any problems. See, Beth Tzedek, I think still does, but the others do not. Or it's a struggle to get a minion. And a lot of them still retain the Zoom minions. For better or for worse, that's reality that is there. I don't know how much the churches have suffered. I think of what I've heard of the churches have also suffered from that. I remember as a youngster, I used to be a huge science fiction reader. I know Ray Bradbury had some stories, but I think there's somebody else who talks about when the world becomes such a place that you see, all you do is have TV screens, right? You interact with people on these screens, and we're about getting there. But a synagogue can be and should be a community. The best synagogues are the ones that create a sense of community, that you feel part and parcel of not just the institution, but the people there. And the ones that are succeed and keep it are the ones that can maintain that kind of relationship. But, you know, and there's always a question of how you maintain, how you pay for the lights, what have you. Various experiments are coming about. I don't know when synagogue membership came into being. Right? If you go to the old style traditional Orthodox synagogue, there's usually a pushka. Anybody know what a pushka is?
Yes.
A charity box. Okay, and you put some money in the charity box. You have an aliyah to the Torah, you're expected to cough up some money to pay for this, get to the synagogue for the aliyah. Right? But you know, and people, you know, the rabbis or the leadership of the synagogue would go to big givers and say, "Can you help us out to X, Y, and Z?" At some point, it became a membership, like a country club. And even that didn't necessarily pay for the full expenses. And you had catering and you had other things that, and outsiders who would pay for this and that. And that becomes a problem. Large synagogues usually have large budgets, which means large dues. And not everybody can afford it. Some synagogues have what they call a fair share. You are asked to give a percentage of your income. Some said, all right, so give what you think you can give. And if you didn't give what they thought was enough, they might call you on the phone and say, how about coughing up a few more dollars? Some have various appeals during the course of the year, especially Yisker. Yisker appeal is usually a big one. I mean, all the conservative things usually have a Yisker appeal and an Israel bonds appeal. Right? But some are experimenting with no dues. I know one Bethel in Minneapolis, which my wife had grown up in, have eliminated dues from their structure. It's all voluntary contributions. Various formats that are used to maintain the salaries of the personnel, the lights, everything else that's involved with the synagogue. But ultimately, the synagogue should be a place of prayer, of community, of study. In the 1930s and 40s, and especially in the 50s later on, they created what they called synagogue centers. Synagogue centers was the kind of place I grew up in. Not only was it a synagogue, not only did it have a school, it had a gymnasium, it had youth programs, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, youth programs. It ran a day camp in the summer. All of these sports things. We had basketball games, teams, and football teams and stuff like that. The progenitor of that was a man by the name of Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of the Reconstructionist movement, who really pushed for this idea of the synagogue center. The synagogue would be the locus for everything. And still, to some extent, some synagogues still run on that kind of a model. And then there are what we call shtibel. Anybody know what shtibel is? Shtibel is a little room. People come to daven, come to pray, and pay the rent somehow, and that's all they need and want. And you have minions that pop up for the high holidays. One likes to sing. If you see their ads, but those are just for that purpose. And then people will come around. And I remember I lived in Southfield, Michigan, and Southfield. Unfortunately, the reality of Detroit Jewish life was the Jews kept moving out. And the reality was African Americans started to move in and white Americans started moving out. And actually what happened was when lower class blacks moved in, upper class blacks moved out. I mean, it was more a wealth issue than it really was a color issue in many ways. But I remember one time there's some words going around that maybe my shul that I was the rabbi, I was going to move. And a woman called me up to give me a hard time about it. I said, let me ask you a question. Are you a member of my synagogue? No. Do you belong to a synagogue? No. Then what are you talking to me about? And that's, you'll get people who kvetch. Another good important term to know. Everybody know what kvetch means?
Yes.
All right, I'm kvetching about it now. People kvetch about the synagogues when they don't do anything to make the synagogue exist. This synagogue is no good. That synagogue is no good. So create your own synagogue. Get some people together who'll share your kvetches and create a synagogue. Nobody's stopping you. There's no law in Canada that you can't create your own synagogue. And then when you've got it, and you got to worry about the budget, and you got to worry about what's your ritual and who gets to do what and whatever, then you'll see what's it all about. But synagogues will be here. The form and shape they will take will change over the course of time, I'm sure, to some extent. The Orthodox world is much more narrowly constrained. because of having to be able to walk to the synagogue, or at least be able to put your car around the corner so they don't see you driving up. The old joke was in a Reform synagogue, people park in front of the temple. Conservative synagogue, they park in back. In the Orthodox synagogue, around the corner. But well, overwhelming majority of most people today, if they belong to an Orthodox synagogue, they're not going to be driving. So they create communities of necessity. Their problem is when you have to move and you're trying to move and create a new community, it's very difficult. Conservative communities, Reform communities, because people drive to the synagogue, they can, live in Yadamsveld. And now with Zoom and all of that, they can live in Saskatoon or Yellowknife or whatever you want. And I think there's a shul in Saskatoon, I think. Yellowknife, I'm pretty sure there's not. Nor in Whitehorse. I know these names. Even I was watching the news tonight with Jake Tapper. He was talking about the business about the Ukrainian who was actually served in the German army, and he said, "Oh, Canada." I caught it. I don't know how many listeners caught it. Okay, any questions? Okay, please find an opportunity for Simchas Torah at least to show up in the synagogue. Maybe Ben Shlul an etrog. I didn't bring mine tonight. I picked mine up yesterday, so I have mine. And find a sukkah and at least go and freeze it a little bit. Okay, Ethan, you were going to work on the. Were you who volunteered to do about the creating a my email? That was my fault. Okay, so you okay? I will, God willing and believe. Okay, I will. I will please God remember to send it to you.
She's administrator.